Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Fatima Rodriguez, and I'm the Communications and Recruitment Coordinator here at InterExchange. And today I'm joined by my colleague, Tammin Nicholson. Tammin, I'll let you introduce yourself as we kick off this presentation.
Hi everyone, my name is Tammin Nicholson. I'm the program manager for the Career Training USA program at InterExchange, and I'm excited to present our latest career guidance topic about interview tips.
Awesome. So before we get started again, I just wanted to briefly go over who we are. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with InterExchange, we are a cultural exchange organization based in New York City. And our mission is to enable global experiences by assisting students and young professionals from overseas, like yourselves, to partake in cultural exchange programs in the US, and then also help US students and young professionals experience programs in other countries. And within InterExchange, the Career Training USA program works with those seeking to undertake internships and traineeships in the United States. So for that reason today, we're going to discuss interview tips, whether that's in person or virtual. And this is a really important aspect of the internship application process. And we want to make sure that you as a candidate are able to showcase yourself during that stage of the process. And a bit of housekeeping before I turn it over to Tammin to begin the presentation. Everyone right now is muted, so if you have any questions, please type it into the chat box and we'll read them off as they come in if they're pertaining to that portion of the presentation. But we do have a question and answer aspect at the end of the presentation. So if there's something you'd like to ask that isn't necessarily related to the current slide, then we can talk about those questions later. And if you join us a little late, or if you have to leave early, this session is recorded, and everyone who is registered will get a recording of the session. So with that, Tammin, I'll turn it over to you to get this presentation started.
Awesome, thank you. So I will just start with a brief outline of what we're going to talk about today. We will start with the differences between in-person interviews and remote interviews and the things that you need to take into account for both of those types of settings. We'll also talk about the different techniques that you'll need to think about as you prepare for your interview, again, whether it's in person or whether it's remote, so that you have everything covered the day of your actual interview. And then we'll talk about what the interview might look like and what to expect during that hour or 30 minutes that you have. The second half of the presentation will focus on common questions and some of the best responses that you can offer to those questions, trying to figure out what the interviewer is actually asking you. And then we'll conclude with some follow-ups and what to do after the interview. And like Fatima said, we have a question and answer portion at the end, but we do, if you've been on any of these sessions, you know we have built-in breaks along the way to pause for questions as they might come in. Okay, so let's jump right in. So how do you prepare for an interview? What should you do to prepare? When it comes to preparation for an interview, it's not so much how do you prepare, but how much do you prepare? You definitely need to be preparing for an interview. And as we go through these slides, I do want to note that any of the ones that are yellow and dark blue, that would be for any interview. Anything that's light blue and dark blue, that's going to be specifically focused on virtual interviews. So like I said, it's not so much do you prepare, but how do you prepare for the interview? And these are the things that you really need to consider as you're starting your preparation, to confirm the date and time of your interview, to make sure that you know that you can get there on time, that you've already gone to the office and you've figured out how long it's going to take you, how long it might take you to get through security, how long the travel might take if it's rush hour, or if there's other factors that contribute to your commute. So you want to just do a test run before you actually have your interview. Make sure that you're there with enough time, preferably 15 minutes early. You don't want to show up too early, but you certainly don't want to show up the minute of your interview or a few minutes late. Again, there's going to be extra time that you want to build into that confirmation. As you prepare, you should also be thinking about what you're going to wear, and make sure that you do dress appropriately for the interview, and also for the company culture. Most times you're going to be wearing business formal, maybe at minimum business casual, but if if the company culture is more relaxed, you want to make sure that you are paying attention to what that company culture is. I once interviewed at an organization, and the HR director sent in the interview a note that says we are a casual attire organization. So if I had showed up in a suit, it would have been clear that I didn't do any research about this organization. So make sure that you dress appropriately for what that company culture is, if you can figure that out from your research. Another thing you should do to prepare is to bring your resume and your portfolio, if that's applicable to your field. You've probably sent your resume, you've sent your cover letter to the organization, but just in case the interviewer doesn't have it on hand, or there's things that you specifically want to point out on your resume, and maybe it doesn't come off the same electronically if they're looking at a screen, just shows that you're prepared by having those additional documents with you. Another big component of preparation for an interview is to research. Know all you can know about the company, and then practice. Practice making sure that you're able to convey that information that you've done research for, and you can pull out in an interview. So maybe practice with some family or friends, have them toss some questions to you, maybe about the company, maybe about typical interview questions that you can feed off of to demonstrate that you're a good fit for this organization. But it's important to just practice as you formulate those best responses. And another way that you can actually practice for an interview is to record yourself. That way you can hear your cadence, your speech, maybe any words that you use often or too often as filler words. It's kind of uncomfortable sometimes to hear your own voice and hear your own recording, but it's really helpful just so you can see and hear how you look and sound, and your comfort level with certain questions. The last thing on this list about preparation is to prepare to send a thank you. And I don't mean to type it up and to send it off ahead of time, but if you plan to send a letter via post, get the stamp, get the envelope, do all of that legwork ahead of time. So after you finish the interview, all you have to do is just write off the thank you, add in some relevancy to what you talked about with the interviewer, and send it off. Same thing even if you plan to send an email thank you. Look for the interviewer's email address so that you have that information ahead of time, and you can just send off that thank you once you finish up the interview and not have to delay that last step. The next slide is the preparation steps that you also want to take into account for a remote interview. And there's many more remote interviews in 2021 than there have been in the past, because many companies are working remotely or simply not having visitors come into their office. So while this does give a lot more flexibility to those seeking internships from a different country or from a different continent, there are additional preparation steps for a remote interview. So I included all of the steps from the last slide with some new things to consider italicized for a remote interview. So for any type of remote interview, you're also going to need to download the software and test it out. And this might be really easy, or it might be a little bit more troublesome. If you're familiar with Zoom, but not GoToMeeting or WebEx or whatever the preferred interview software is of that company. You're also going to want to test out your video and your audio and make sure it's working well, and you can be heard clearly, and your microphone works and your speakers work. Again, this is where doing a test call with a family member or friends can really help as part of your practice. During that time, you should also find an interview space. Unlike an in-person interview, you need to create that professional setting, that quiet setting, or that individual interview room. So it's on you to turn your home or wherever you currently are into that professional space for the interview period, making sure that your distractions are away, your pets are away, your cell phone's in another room, your roommates or your family members they know what's going on, and they could keep it down for the duration of your interview. Also remove any clutter from your background or whatever that interview space is that you're going to use. Again, you're turning a personal space into what needs to be a professional space for that period of time. There's a lot of softwares that have fake backgrounds you can use to hide your background, but just don't count on that being available. Make sure that you can find an area that looks professional, even if you don't have the fake background or whatever it is. Like I said, the goal here is just to do your best to replicate that professional interview space that you would find if you actually went into a company's office. So let's talk a little bit more about this research step. We said that research was a key component of interview preparation, but what do you need to be researching? So the first place to start as you research for your interview as part of preparation is to look at the company's mission and values. You want to make sure that you show up to the interview with anecdotes that match the traits that are referenced in the mission and values on the company website. Probably at least 3 stories for each of the values. Just that way you have more than enough stories and experience that you can pull from to demonstrate that you are the best fit for this company. You certainly don't have to say them all, but just having them in the back of your mind is really useful. So if their values include integrity or working with others, make sure that you can demonstrate how you fit into that company culture. Another thing to look at is professional associations. And this can help you as you um, develop a rapport with the interviewer, as you get an understanding of how they fit into your current network. You understand the company's focus a little bit more. What direction are they moving in? What are their goals for the next 5 years, the next 10 years? Are there any overlapping connections or experiences that you have that you can mention during that time that you have them face to face? And again, that's going to help you to build rapport with your interviewer. Speaking of rapport with your interviewer, also do a bit of research on that person if you know who they are. So what is their career path? What is their interest? How long have they been at the company? See if you can find information about that person so that you can steer the conversation towards what those overlapping attributes are that you have and they might have. And also it makes the process a little less daunting if you have an idea or a general picture of who that person might be that you'll be interviewing with. You can also see if you can find any potential interview questions from maybe your network, maybe some online websites. We've talked about LinkedIn on a lot of these sessions, but sometimes LinkedIn will have information about what the interview process looks like at an organization. Glassdoor is another great website where past and current employees can talk about their own experience with the organization so that you have an idea of what the process is going to look like, what the questions might be, and that'll give you an advantage going in the door. As always, be flexible and be prepared that what you find online might not exactly match your own experience, but just having an idea of what to expect will certainly help your preparation and make things a lot easier for you. So for a remote interview, again, all of those things are applicable. Those are all things to consider for a remote interview. But again, there's a little bit more logistics going into it. So I just want to talk about, as you prepare, about the who, what, when, how type stuff like that. So make sure that you have the logistics all sorted for a remote interview. Make sure that you've found a quiet, private space. Make sure that you have the proper software, you have a stable internet connection, the battery on your computer is at 100%. Your distractions are as far away as possible. So you've put a note on your doorbell so that delivery men shouldn't ring the bell during your interview. You've closed the windows so you can minimize outside noises. If there are any other distractions that you can't avoid, it's okay to acknowledge them, but doing your best to make sure that you have developed that quiet space. Another thing to do is to make sure that you have dressed professionally from head to toe. I think the joke is that if you work from home, you can wear a more formal business attire on the top and wear pajama bottoms. But what if you need to plug your computer into an outlet, or if you need to stand up to get a pen or close the window? You don't want to stand up and be in your slippers. It'll just make you feel more in the zone if you're completely dressed head to toe in professional attire. And like I said, organize the space behind and in front of you. I would declutter all of the computer tabs, silence all of your notifications on your computer. I would also recommend closing any program that is not related to your interview, so you're not tempted or you're not clicking around on your computer. I think another thing to note is if you wear glasses, the interviewer is going to be able to see if your screen keeps changing colors. Clearly, you're on some website and you're not giving them your full attention. So I think remote interviews make the process a lot easier, but there is a lot more considerations that you need to think of if you're not doing an in-person interview. You would need to think about the daylight savings, if the time zone is different, or who's calling who, just those type of logistics that you don't typically need to worry about if you can walk into an office and have an interview the traditional way. So I want to focus on software and camera tips a little bit as well. So like I said, it's really important to test out your audio and your video for a remote interview. Make sure that your microphone and your headphones work, that there's no echo in your voice, there's no weird feedback, there's no background noises. And the easiest way to do that is just to call someone to test it out, like I said. But another important thing to test out is your camera. So this is your first impression, and you want to make sure that you have a clear picture, that your camera's at eye level. So test out where you'll put your laptop or where you'll put your computer. Maybe try a few different locations in your home and try and recreate the space exactly as it'll be during your interview. In my home, the light changes drastically from evening or from afternoon to morning. So I would want to make sure that if my interview is at 3 o'clock my time, I'm trying out that space at 3 o'clock, so I know exactly how dark or bright the room might be. Make sure your computer is also at eye level, and add any lighting if needed. Once you have everything set up, if your computer is sitting on exactly 5 books and that'll be eye level, make sure you take a picture of what the computer looks like, what the setup looks like, so on the day of your interview, you can recreate that exactly. The point of doing all of this work ahead of time is so when your interview actually happens, there's no other distractions. You're not on mute, or you're not inaudible, or your video doesn't come off weird because you've done all this work ahead of time. So I keep stressing these simple logistics, but it sets everything up so the interview process is as smooth as possible if you're doing a remote interview. Okay, so now that you've prepped for the interview, let's move into some of the more general tips for once the interview is underway. The first thing to do, and the most important thing to do, is try to find a way to connect with your interviewer and build rapport. Hopefully you have some ideas on how to do this based on your own research. Maybe there's professional career paths that overlap. Maybe you have a similar degree to them, but try and find a way to figure out what that professional connection might be with them, especially if this is the person that you'll work underneath during your actual internship or your work alongside. It's good to have an idea of what their professional pathway is. There might also be some ways to build rapport personally. Maybe you went to the same university, or you're from the same hometown. I think it's okay to do some research on the person and figure out how you might have some personal connections, maybe some LinkedIn connections, but be careful about how deep you go. You don't want to try and build rapport by saying to them that you found them on Instagram and you live in the same neighborhood. That might be a little bit too deep. You want to make sure you keep it a little bit more general than that. Another way to build rapport is through projects. Maybe they've done some similar initiatives or worked with similar software as you, and you have some overlaps about some of those past achievements or some of those completions that they've done as part of their career. Another important thing to do during an interview is to demonstrate both an interest in the position and a fit for the position. Some people will be able to demonstrate interest but aren't a good fit, and vice versa. So the interviewer's job is to ensure that you fit both criteria. And to do this, you want to expand outward on your qualifications and demonstrate an interest in why you're applying to this organization and that you're a perfect fit for this organization. So be prepared to talk at length about any achievements that you've put in your resume, any achievements you've put in your cover letter, because those are the pieces that have gotten you to the interview stage, and you want to make sure that you can expand on them and you can drive home those important points. And for that reason, pay attention to the parts of your resume and the parts of your career history that the interviewer focuses on. You might have 15 bullet points in your resume, but if they're focusing on just 2 or 3, those are important things to note, and those are important things to be able to talk about, because that's clearly what the company is most interested in most interested in as far as your whole background. In a remote interview, you might not have the same body language clues to understand if key portions of your resume or key portions of what you're saying have resonated with the interviewer. So it's really important to steer the conversation to any points that they're talking about verbally if you don't have the same nonverbal clues. So for a remote interview, there's a few other general tips and advice. I think you have an advantage during an actual interview if you're doing the interview remotely, because you can have notes and resources that you typically might not have going into a regular face-to-face interview. So you can have a list of talking points on hand, and I would keep them at eye level behind your computer screen so it's not evident if you're looking down and you're reading notes. These should just be talking points though, or these should just be questions that you want to ask. These aren't scripted responses. You don't want it to sound like it's scripted response. You want to make sure it sounds natural, and they're just things to jog your memory when you're asked a certain question. Another thing to do if you are in a remote interview is make sure that you use a tablet if you're taking notes. Don't type on the keyboard, because then you'll be typing in the ear of the interviewer and they'll just hear the clacking of the keys. They might not hear what they're saying, they might hear what you're saying. So if you do have any notes that you want to take, make sure that you have a pen and paper and you're writing them down as well. I talked before in one of the first slides about bringing your resume and bringing your cover letter or your portfolio to an interview. It's the same thing for a remote interview. You want to make sure that you have those documents handy, and I would put them in a folder on your desktop and be prepared to share your screen if necessary. So if you're ready to share your screen, make sure your desktop is fully cleared, make sure any unnecessary tabs are closed, just that it's as sleek as possible. So if you do need to share your screen, it's not a bunch of clutter. Some other general tips during a remote interview to just be cognizant of is that there's no warm up. There's no waiting room or walk down the hallway with the person to maybe kind of have those first few greeting impressions. So your first impression starts as soon as the video comes on. So make sure that you're there a few minutes early and they're not turning on to start an interview with you and there's no one on the other side. Make sure that you are smiling and looking at the camera and paying attention even before the interview starts. That way they don't log in and see an empty chair or see you talking to someone off screen or see you taking notes or just not paying attention. Make sure that you're just kind of looking at the camera. It sounds awkward. It is a little awkward, but you want to make sure that as soon as that video clicks on, the first impression they have of you is a positive one. During the interview, also be mindful of your body language and your tone, but not to the point of distraction. Nodding, smiling, these are all important ways to keep a connection throughout the interview, and it makes the interviewee more memorable to the interviewer. So we'll talk about this on the next slide, but make sure that you're staying engaged during the conversation in nonverbal ways, and you are keeping eye contact and you're looking at where your camera is, not where your screen is. I know many people will put a post-it next to their webcam that reminds them to look actually at their webcam, because if they look at the screen, they're looking down and not actually making eye contact with the person on the other end. So it's another thing, just totally different than if you were to do a regular in-person interview. And the last thing on that topic is also remember that the screen is not a mirror. So you definitely don't want to be looking at yourself in the picture and maybe fixing your hair. You're looking at the webcam and you're looking at that person so that you can show non-verbally that you are paying 100% attention to them. So the reason that you would want to make non-verbal cues is the audio aspect of a remote interview. You want to limit any extra noises, so computer notification audio, anything like that. But verbal cues and other noise interjections are going to disrupt the flow of the conversation. In some systems, your microphone might override theirs if you're both talking at the same time, And if you only have 30 minutes, you're wasting valuable time by having them repeat themselves or ask a question in a different way or have you repeat yourself. So do your best to stay focused, but don't interject, nod, or show that you're paying attention in other nonverbal ways. And again, if you take notes, I would also say that you're taking notes just so they know why you might be looking down from time to time. Or if they see the flutter of your hand, it's because you're writing down some of the important things that they're saying. I would also recommend that you leave some space between um, their question and your answer. Maybe just count to three, because the interviewer might have a delay on their side. They might haven't finished their question. They also might be taking notes when you finish your question. So if you finish and you don't hear anything right away, it's not a cue that you haven't said enough. It just could be a cue that there's a small delay or that they're trying to take note of some of the important things that you said. So that's another tough thing to note in a general interview of are they waiting for me to say more or are they just taking notes? But in most cases, they are simply just taking notes. For this reason, I think you can indicate and you can make it a little bit easier on them of when you're done speaking. So in some cases, this might not be apparent to the interviewer of when you've actually finished your response. And you can indicate that you're done speaking by restating the thesis of your answer. You might do this by just reiterating, and that's my most successful professional achievement, and that's how I learned how to successfully manage multiple events at the same time. So that's kind of a good thesis of what you had said. You wouldn't just say, okay, I'm done speaking. Try and just restate what it is that you've said and sum that up. Also, if you need time to think, say so. Because again, with a remote interview, they might think that there is an issue with the audio or that there's a lost connection or something like that. So if you need a couple seconds to formulate your answer, just say, okay, that's a great question. I need a second or two to collect my thoughts, and then give yourself a second or two and formulate that response instead of just sitting there in silence. So with that, I want to stop and talk about any questions that have come in before we move on to some of the common interview questions and some of the best ways to respond to those questions.
Hi, so we have about 3 questions that came in. The first question is, what is appropriate attire for an intern interview?
So I think even if you're interviewing for an intern position, that advice would be the same as a job interview. If you're interviewing a company where the attire is business formal, you should wear business formal or even a little above that for your interview. If it's business casual, I would wear above that for your interview. Even if you're not applying for a job and you're applying for an internship, that advice still stands.
Great. Second question is, what professional background should I have for a remote interview?
If you don't have one of the formal settings, I think if you're going to use a background on a computer program, I think a simple one color would be the best. But if you don't have a background and you need to show a portion of your home, I think the cleaner the better. So a white wall, maybe one plant, one picture, anything you can do to recreate what an office space might look like. But I think typically the less you can have in your background, the better, because you want them to focus on you and not what's going on in the picture behind your head or what kind of books are on your bookshelf. It's you as a candidate. So that's really what you want the focus to be on.
Great. We have another question that came in is, what if you don't have experience and my host employer wants someone with more experience? How should I go about talking about my professional background?
So that's a great question, and that's something I think we're going to get into in the second half of this session as we talk about some of the common interview questions and how to formulate those responses. So I think let's come back to that one towards the end of the presentation and see if we still haven't answered it.
Great. And the last question that came in is, what if I can't find information about the company values to match my background?
So if you're doing research and you're looking for a specific mission, the values of the company, and you're not able to find that information, I think you're fine to go with some of the more general attributes that any company would want. So I would say if you can't find their values, it's safe to assume things like innovation, collaboration, effective communication, good judgment. Those are all things that they would want to see in a successful employee. So you can highlight some of those aspects. No company is not going to want someone that demonstrates leadership or demonstrates an ability to be resourceful and stay organized. So I would think of some of those more general aspects that most companies would have as values if you can't find anything on the company website that indicates specifically what their values are or specifically what the important components are of their mission.
Awesome. Thanks, Tammin. That's all the questions that came in for right now.
Great. So let's move into common interview questions and how to answer them. So we'll start with how to answer, and then we'll dive specifically into questions. So the best thing to remember in an interview is that you want your answers to be clear. Answer the question that was asked of you. Don't start this rambling story that eventually ties in, but it's going to take 5 minutes to actually get to the point. You really want to avoid any elaborate or rambling responses, and just make sure that if they ask you a simple question, you give them a simple answer that conveys an important point or two. There are more difficult questions that will arise in interviews that are more related to your behavior and some of the soft skills and things that might not stand out on your resume that they want to make sure, again, that you're a good fit for the company culture and the person that they're seeking for that position. So for these type of behavioral questions, you can rely on the STAR method. Whenever an interviewer asks you for an example of a situation or an example of something that's going to document some of your soft skills. So the STAR method, if you haven't heard of it before, is situation, task, action, and result. It's a way to answer a complex question in a short anecdote form. Most professional resources state that this is like primarily how the behavioral interview section of the interview question would be answered. And so if you start by reiterating what the situation is. So you would want to describe a specific event or situation and not a generalized description of what you've done in the past. Be sure to give enough detail that the interviewer understands what the situation is. It can be from a previous job, it can be from a volunteer experience, it could be from really any related activity or event. And then a sentence or two about what the task is that was assigned to you, what you were working toward, whatever it was that you were trying to accomplish. And then talk about the action, the actions you took to address that situation and achieve that task with an appropriate amount of detail to keep the focus on you and on your skills. So what steps did you take and what was your particular contribution to whatever the project was? Be careful that you don't describe what the team did or what the group did, and you keep the focus on you. Try and use the word I instead of we as far as any describing actions that were undertaken. And then the result. What was the outcome of your actions? And don't be shy about taking credit for your behavior. Make sure that you remember, it's not the time to be modest. What happened? How did it end? What did you accomplish? What did you learn? Make sure the answer contains positive results as well. And if you can, try and quantify the experience by using numbers. So an example of a response for the STAR through the STAR method might be if someone asks you to tell them about a time when you went above and beyond to complete a project. Your response could be something like, in my last position, my manager got sick right before our annual fundraiser, so I volunteered to coordinate with various teams to ensure that the event still went ahead as planned. I held an emergency meeting with each of the teams and I facilitated backup plans for guest relations, event logistics, budgetary stuff. The event was a success and it raised 10% more funds than the previous year, and I was able to enhance my knowledge in new areas of operations. That would be an example of a STAR method response. I wouldn't say the word stuff. I heard myself as I gave that response, something a little bit more formal, but I think you get the picture of how you can take a lot of information and consolidate it into 5 or 6 sentences that gives the interviewer a good sense of what your past experience is. So this might take a little bit of practice to get familiar with. It might require you to reorganize some of your stories and some of your own anecdotes, but you can use this as a blueprint to answer any behavioral questions that come and talk about some of those soft skills that complement the hard skills and qualifications on your resume that have got you to the interview stage. Okay, so let's go through some common interview questions that you might be asked during an interview and how to respond to those questions and try and understand what it is that the interviewer is actually asking you. So the first question you might see asked of you in an interview is, tell me about yourself. And they're not asking for your hobbies or where you grew up, but more about you as a candidate and why you're applying for this position and why you match the qualifications. So you want to make sure that your response to tell me about yourself discusses your educational and professional background and how those aspects make you a good fit for the company. See if you can sum it up in about 60 seconds and do your best to make strong connections between your background and the position that you're interviewing for, not just the company, but the position itself. And this is, in a nutshell, it's your elevator pitch to the organization. They'll ask you other questions, but this is going to be your lead in that gives them a little bit of better sense about you as a person. Another common introductory question is, why are you interested in this role? So to answer this question, you want to identify which responsibilities in the role are most interesting to you and also match your background as well. The role might have 10 or 12 different things that you would be responsible for and focus on 2 or 3 that you think are excellent fits that you could do very easily and that really interest you. And be sure to include what it is that you hope to learn from those aspects of the position that might be less familiar to you, and explain what it is that you would be able to contribute to the organization and what it is from the organization that piques your interest. Another question that comes up quite often in many interviews is what do you know about our company? And if you've done your research, this is your time to shine. You can demonstrate that you've prepared for this interview. You know what their mission statement is. You know who their biggest clients are. You've followed them in the news of late. You know what projects they're working on, some initiatives that they plan to roll out. And all this information is widely available on their website, on their blog, their social media. So there's many places you can start to collect this information, and don't be shy to demonstrate that you have prepared for this interview and that you know the company really well based on your own research. Another question that comes up a lot is, what makes you a good candidate for this position? And this is where you can highlight some of the unique qualifications that you have that will let you achieve some of the responsibilities of this position. So you don't want to simply reiterate what's on your resume. You don't simply want to list positive attributes or soft skills that you have. The interview is a way for companies to get a better sense of you as a person and your communication skills, sure, but they also want to continue to know that you can weave in those hard skills that would set you apart from other candidates. So for this answer, try and quantify some hard skills and experience that you have that would make you unique. How many years of experience do you have in fashion design? How familiar are you with the software needed for this position? Have you worked with their clients in different capacities? Try to think of a combination of 2 or 3 of these that would be unique to your background, more than just the minimum qualifications of the position. If the position requires someone to be bilingual, that's not something that's going to set you apart. Try and think of what combination you would have that would make you unique from many other candidates. So some of the tougher questions and some of the tougher questions that you might be asked during an interview that would require more of that behavioral STAR responses might be something like, what are your biggest strengths? And this is where you can discuss some of the technical positions technical skills related to the position. You can discuss your experience and the skills that you have that are directly related to this internship and this training program that you're applying to. So this, going back to that question we had before, if they are looking for someone who has specific skills that you don't have because of the capacity that you've been in your previous positions, think of how you can use the skills that you currently have maybe in a different way in this type of setting. So if they're looking for someone with management experience or someone who's able to manage a team and you've never managed a team professionally, do you have leadership experience in university? Do you have leadership experience in a volunteer organization? What other skills related to the position do you have that might be a little less traditional than what they're looking for? And it's not always going to work. It's not always going to be a good fit for every organization, but make sure you're thinking as broadly as you can about the strengths that you have and how those could tie into what the organizational need is. A typical follow-up to this question is, what are your biggest weaknesses? And this is a really difficult question to answer, and not many people are able to sum it all up correctly. The thing to do here is to not focus on your weaknesses, but focus on how you are actively working to improve in those areas. So you don't want to simply say something negative about yourself to a potential employer and leave it as that. The trick is to turn that into a positive, show that there is progression and some improvement in those areas. If you say that you are, if you struggle to stay organized, talk about some of the time management and organizational practices that you've been implementing and some of the progress you've made towards that goal. No one's perfect, but I think what an organization wants to see in this response is that the areas where you are weak, you're also making sure that you're gaining the skills that are needed to thrive in the position, and you are yourself motivated to identify those weaknesses and correct them as best you can. Another question you might be asked is, what do you consider to be your biggest professional achievement? This is a good time to highlight what interests you the most and what makes you most enthusiastic for this role. You can use this to drill down on areas in your professional experience where you know that you can thrive the most, and show that your professional experience is not just experience, but also something that really excites you and something that you're enthusiastic about, and not just that you check all the boxes, but that you're able to bring that excitement to this organization, and you can grow with them and demonstrate some future professional achievements with that company as well, how they will help you to further along in your professional career path, but then also further along some of the things that you're most passionate about. Great question for the STAR method is, tell me about a challenge at work and how you dealt with it. This is really asking two questions. It's asking how you identify problems, what you consider a problem, and then also how you go about solving those problems. So the STAR method is a great way to demonstrate your problem-solving skills, your planning, your resourcefulness. It's an easy way to show your initiative and your ability to identify problems. If you prepare for this question, you can certainly have a response that will show you as a problem solver and show you as someone who's going to take the initiative when needed, and also what you think makes a great organizational workplace and what you think is something that would be considered a problem in the workplace. So we'll do two more common questions and best responses. So the second to last is, what are you looking for in a new position? This might be something that comes later on in the interview, and this is where you would highlight the ways that you hope to expand upon your current knowledge and skills. So connect the dots of why this company is a natural next step for you. Think about where you might want to be in 5 years, and focus on what some of the skills and experience you hope to have in 5 years might be, and use that as the basis for your question, because the company wants to see if they're going to be able to match where you plan to be in 5 years. So if there's not a position at that company in 5 years that has all of these skills, it's not going to be a good fit. But if you hope to broaden your facilitation skills and work in a stronger customer service oriented position. If the company has those positions and those skill sets, it's a great way to highlight how you want to expand the current skills and knowledge that you do have. And one question that does come up pretty often is, why are you leaving your current role? And this is another tricky one to answer. You don't want to talk negatively about your current company. You don't want to burn any bridges. So discuss what it is you like about your current role and what you like about your current company, but why you think you've outgrown that role and why you're seeking new challenges. You can differentiate your current role and this future role and solely highlight the positives of this role you're interviewing for. Leave out the negatives of your current role as a contrast, and that might be apparent what they are in comparison, but it's never a good idea to talk negatively about your current employer, even if you're interviewing at a competitor. So you have to answer that question by solely focusing on the positive aspects that this new role offers, and just kind of leave the negative aspects of your current role, if there are negative aspects, unsaid. So I also think it's really important to touch on the questions that you should ask an interviewer. So these 4 questions are great basis for questions that really shouldn't go unasked by the end of the interview. So questions like, can you describe the work environment and the office culture of the organization? That is a really important question for 2021. It's very relevant as many companies move to remote settings. The collaboration with supervisors, with peers could be totally different. So I think that's a very valid question that should be asked of any interviewer that you have an interview with ever, but certainly now in 2021. Another great question to ask is, can you give me an example of a project on which interns will be working? And that way they can maybe give you some idea of some of the work that you would be assigned, and you can turn that question around to reinforce some of the experience you have and some other relevant aspects of your resume based on that answer. If they say that you're going to be working on a new communications project and you have all this communications experience, it's great to say, oh, excellent, that's something that really interests me, that's something that I've done a little bit in the past, that I have X amount of years working on. So it's a great reminder at the end that you would be able to successfully complete some of the projects that would be assigned if you got the position. Similarly, you can also ask, what do you think is the most challenging aspect of this position? And this might also give you another chance to reinforce that you have the experience to overcome those challenges. If it's multitasking, if it's time management, if it's things that you've excelled at in the past, you can knock out any concerns and reinforce that you have those type of skills. Another great question to ask is, what skills are most important to this position? And hopefully by this point, they say all the skills that you've already laid out during this interview. So you can just know that, okay, all these skills are skills that I currently have, these are skills that I've relayed to them, and these are skills that they look for in this position. So this could be a good fit, or conversely, maybe this isn't a good fit because I don't have the skills needed to successfully thrive in this position. Other questions that might come up is, what's the typical career path for interns in this department? What are some typical day-to-day responsibilities? All things that should be asked in a way for you to lead it back to the skills that you have and the relevancy of your resume and your work history. Make sure that when it's time to ask the interviewer questions, if they ask you if you have any questions for them, you come prepared and you do ask them something. Even if your questions were answered earlier, make sure that you have some backup questions and you have some important things that you can ask the interviewers. Questions that you really shouldn't be asked, well, that's on the next slide. We'll talk about some questions that you shouldn't ask. So some questions not to ask at the end of the interview are, what are the requirements of this position? If you get to the end of the interview and you're still asking basic questions like, what are the requirements of this position? It shows that you haven't done the research about the company, you haven't done the research about the position, you maybe haven't been listening during the interview. So that's a very introductory question that you should know before you even apply for the position. Another question not to ask is, what are the requirements of this position? I'm sorry, I'm reading the slide wrong. Another question not to ask is, what are the salary and benefits of this position? That's not really an interview question. That's something that you would discuss with HR post-interview. You don't want to count your chickens before they hatch. You don't want to start talking about vacation time and salary when you're still trying to get your foot in the door. You also don't want to ask how quickly you can be promoted. That's another question that's not a good sign that someone's really interested in the position they're applying for, if they're already thinking about how they can move up to the next rung on the ladder or somewhere else in the company. The manager who's hiring you wants to make sure that you're invested in the position that you're applying for. They don't expect you to work there forever, but they don't want to hire someone who's already thinking about what the next step might be, or how quickly they can get out and work somewhere else in the organization. You also shouldn't ask anything that has already been answered. So if a question that you prepared is something that they have addressed in the interview, you don't want to ask it again at the end, because it's just going to sound like you haven't paid attention. So you can ask them to perhaps expand on that response, or maybe talk a little bit more in depth about some component of it. But if they tell you what the company culture is like to start, you don't want to ask at the end of the interview, so what's the company culture like? Because it's gonna look poorly on you as an applicant. You want to make sure that at the end of your interview, you're peaking and your interview ends on the highest note possible. So you don't want to blow it at the end by asking poor questions or no questions at all. You want to make sure that the interviewer ends the interview and they're totally impressed and blown away by you as a candidate, because you've peak ended that interview. And on your side of things, when the interview does end, you want to make sure that you know what the next steps are. So it's important that the interview ends, and if they haven't answered the question about what the next steps are, you ask them, and you have an understanding of how long it'll be until the next interview or the next stage in the process, or an ultimate decision on who they'll invite into this position. So make sure that you have a good understanding when the interview wraps up as far as what the next step is going to be. So the last thing to keep in mind for an interview, any interview, remote or in person, at the end, to send a personalized thank you. This can be email, this can be in the mail if you know that there's a bit of time before a decision is going to be made, but you typically within 24 hours want to send something off that is personalized and follows up on some of the conversational points that you've talked about, and you send something that's genuine and actually thanks them for taking the time to interview you as a candidate, to come and speak to you. From there, you can ask for updates when it's appropriate. If they tell you it's going to be 2 weeks before they make a decision, it's okay to follow up in 3 weeks. I wouldn't follow up in 2 days, but it's totally appropriate if you haven't heard anything from the organization to ask for some updates, see if there's any information that they'll need, if they want your references, or if there's anything further as far as the hiring process. And if you don't get the position, keep the company in mind for future opportunities. Maintain a network with the interviewer and the organization. It's still okay to invite them on LinkedIn, see if there's any feedback they have about professional development. Most companies probably aren't going to be in the position to offer feedback, but some might, and they might tell you, we thought you're a great candidate, we just think you need a little bit more experience with X or Y or whatever the skill set is, and that way you can gain that experience and perhaps apply in a year or 6 months once you've accumulated whatever the skills are or the experience that the organization is looking for. So just because the interview doesn't end in an internship offer, it doesn't mean that it's all for nothing. So with that, I'm going to give everyone a little bit of time to put any questions that they've thought of as we talked about some of the interview questions into the chat box. I want to highlight that we have 3 more webinars coming up in this series. So we're going to switch gears starting next week and start talking about US culture. My colleague Abigail will discuss US workplace culture, and then in 2 weeks, English in the US workplace. And our last session will be a session with 4 alumni, one current intern, to discuss their internship experience and some of the advice that they have for a successful internship in the United States. If you've missed any of our past webinars, there are a few down here, but they're all on our YouTube channel, so you can look at some advice for developing in-demand skills, searching for internships, finding a mentor, writing cover letters, developing your LinkedIn profile, all of the things that will hopefully help you find an internship in the United States. Fatima, do we have any questions that have come through?
Sorry, I was muted. So we have 4 questions that came in. The first question is, what do I do if I don't know how to answer a question?
So if you go to an interview and you are asked a question that you don't know the answer for, it's important that you say something and that you do provide some type of answer. I think it's what I would first do is say, I need a little bit of time to think, and then try to think of what a response is going to be that's going to be at least tangent to what they ask for. So even going back to the example where if you don't have experience as a manager, could you think about other times where you led a team or you were in a leadership position? You want to make sure that you give some type of answer and something that is related to whatever the question is. But I think it's important to make sure that you don't go off on a too far of a tangent and you do your best to keep roped into that response. But if you need a couple seconds to think and formulate your ideas, like I said, it's also totally fine to ask that in advance.
Great. The second question is, what if my answers have already been answered?
So if you've prepared questions to ask them and they have answered those as part of the interview, that's when I would go back and try to ask something a little bit deeper based on some of those responses. And that might be where it's helpful to take notes. If they're answering questions during the interview of things you had planned to ask at the end, you don't want to get to the end and say, oh, you answered all my questions, great. I would say, oh, well, I was planning to ask you more about this specific project, and thanks for that detail. Could you provide a little bit more of how the interns would play into that role, or what the long-term goal is of that project? So try to drill down on some of those things that maybe have already been answered and were questions that you had prepared in advance.
The next question is, how long should a star response be?
I would try to keep it to about 5 or 6 sentences. So depending on your pattern of speech, maybe about a minute or so, maybe a little bit longer. But that's, again, you don't want to go too far off. So pay attention to the body language of the person interviewing you, and if they look bored or if they're trying to move it along, cut the story short. But I think a minute or two is absolutely fine.
Thank you for that. And the last question is, we have another question after this, sorry. The next question is, how long should I wait to follow up after the interview?
This is another one that's going to depend on the organization and what they've told you. If they say that you'll hear back in 2 weeks, I would give them maybe 3 weeks. But if they say it's going to be 2 months, or we have 20 more candidates that we're going to invite, it might be much longer before you hear back from the organizations. So I think that's why it's vital at the end of the interview to ask them what the next steps are, so that you know when it is appropriate to follow up after your interview.
Great, thank you. And another question came in, but I'm not quite sure if he is asking if he can ask a question in Spanish to us, or if he can ask a question in Spanish to the host employer. So I don't know if you'd like to clarify for that, or if Tammin, you'd like to take that question.
I think that if you're interviewing for a US organization, most likely the interview would be conducted in English, but that's going to depend on all organizations. I would just reiterate that the J1 visa, business English or English as a language of operation is something that is typically expected as part of cultural engagement and in the cultural exchange that is part of the program. But if it was the latter and you'd like to ask us a question in Spanish, we are just over time, but you can certainly email us at training.interexchange.org, and we're happy to answer any general questions or specific application questions that you have through our email.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Shannon, for answering all those questions for us. I'm sure it was definitely helpful for the audience.
So well, thank you, everyone, and have a great morning, evening, afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. And we'll see you all next week.
All right. Have a good day. Good night. Bye.